In the summer of 1242, the people of London crowded the filthy, narrow streets, pressing together in restless anticipation. They had come not merely to witness a death, but to watch a performance. Before them stood William de Marisco, chained and broken, a man whose fate had already been sealed by royal decree. To some he was a pirate, to others a rebel, to the crown he was a traitor. But whatever he had been, on this day he would become something else entirely, a message. His execution was not about justice, it was about fear. William's punishment would become infamous, a ritual so savage that it burned itself into English history. He would not simply be hanged. He would be dragged, disemboweled, quartered, and displayed like a butchered animal. His death would not end when his heart stopped beating. His body would live on as a warning, his severed limbs turned into political billboards, nailed up in distant towns so no one could mistake the cost of treason. To understand how William came to this fate, we must return to the world of 13th century England. This was not a land of certainty or safety. The crown was fragile, power was contested, and loyalty could be bought as quickly as it could be broken. King Henry III sat upon the throne, a monarch who believed his rule was divinely ordained, but whose grasp on authority was always tenuous. England was restless, nobles whispered of rebellion, and the seas were prowled by men who paid no homage to king or crown. In such a climate, suspicion was often more dangerous than fact. To be accused was as damning as to be guilty, and for William de Marisco, accusation was a shadow that had followed his family for generations. The de Mariscos were Anglo-Norman nobility, descendants of men who had crossed with William the Conqueror, but unlike many noble families, theirs was a name that carried more suspicion than respect. Tales of piracy, betrayal, and dishonor clung to them. To King Henry, they were a family marked by disloyalty, a weak link in the chain of fealty that bound his kingdom together. In a world where bloodline determined destiny, William inherited not only his ancestors' lands, but also their cursed reputation. In 1238, King Henry III survived what chroniclers recorded as an assassination attempt. The attack itself was murky. Accounts differ on whether it was a genuine plot or the fevered suspicion of a paranoid court. But in a world where whispers could become verdicts, it hardly mattered. The king's enemies were many, and when blame was cast, William de Marisco's name rose quickly to the surface. Evidence was thin, almost non-existent. No weapon was found in William's hand. No confession was wrung from his lips. Yet in the eyes of the king, and in the dangerous logic of medieval justice, accusation by the crown was equal to proof. Treason was not merely a legal crime. It was blasphemy, an act of cosmic disorder, a challenge to the divine authority of the monarch. To accuse William was to condemn him. William understood his position well enough. If he submitted to trial, the outcome was predetermined. He would hang, guilty or not. So he made his choice. He fled justice, cast aside the protections of law, and embraced the life of an outlaw. In this decision lay the seeds of his legend. Fleeing to the sea, William sought refuge on a desolate stronghold. Lundy Island, a barren slab of rock rising from the Bristol Channel. To many, it was inhospitable, a place fit only for seabirds and storms. But to William, it was perfect. Its cliffs rose sheer from the waters, its approaches were treacherous, and its position commanded one of the busiest shipping lanes in England. From Lundy he could watch, strike, and vanish, untouchable by the crown soldiers. For 4 years, William and his men transformed Lundy into the heart of a pirate kingdom. Merchant ships laden with wool, wine, salt, and grain fell prey to his raids. Royal vessels too were harassed, their crews humiliated, their cargo stolen. Every raid enriched William's coffers, but more importantly, every raid humiliated King Henry. Each attack was proof that the crown could not defend its own waters. To merchants, it was disaster. To common folk, it was legend. Around tavern fires, men whispered of William the Pirate Lord, the rebel who mocked the king himself. Yet every story that celebrated William also deepened Henry's rage. Authority in the 13th century was fragile, and for the king to be defied openly was more than insult. It was danger. As long as William remained free, he was not merely a pirate, he was an idea. The years William de Marisco spent on Lundy Island were years of defiance, of survival, and of spectacle. He was not a hidden outlaw skulking in shadows. He was a pirate lord, bold and audacious, daring the crown to act. Ships that once sailed in safety now feared the sight of his sails. Families of merchants cursed his name, while storytellers and common folk turned him into a folk hero. For every raid, the tale grew larger. Lundy gave William both protection and power. Its cliffs formed natural walls, and its narrow approaches were treacherous for unfamiliar captains. Even the royal fleet, commanded by officers of the king, found it nearly impossible to land forces there without losing men and ships. The island became a fortress not just of stone, but of reputation. Each failed attempt to dislodge William added to his legend. He was not just surviving, he was taunting the most powerful man in England. But William's success came at a cost. Every ship seized, every raid on royal property made his crimes undeniable. What began as suspicion of treason became, in the eyes of the crown, a campaign of open rebellion. And rebellion could not be tolerated. Henry III faced a dilemma. To ignore William was to accept humiliation, but to attack him risked further failure. The king's advisors knew that repeated defeats only emboldened rebellion. What Henry needed was not just victory, he needed spectacle. William's capture had to be more than punishment. It had to be a warning, carved into the memory of the realm. By 1242, betrayal brought William down. Some say it was one of his own men, lured by promises of safety or money. Others suggest a trap, a clever strategy by the crown to catch him off guard. However it happened, William was taken alive. Chains replaced the salt spray of the sea. He was carried not to a battlefield, not to a quiet execution, but to London, the very heart of royal power. His journey south was itself a kind of theater. Word spread faster than the carts that bore him. The pirate king of Lundy was captured. Soon Londoners would witness what happened when defiance met royal justice. When William de Marisco was dragged before the crown in London, there was no question of fairness, no jury to weigh evidence, no chance of mercy. His fate was sealed long before he entered the city. His trial, if one could even call it that, was not about determining guilt, but about crafting a story of betrayal, rebellion, and punishment that would serve the king's needs. The charges were sweeping, almost theatrical in their scope. He was accused not only of piracy, but of high treason, rebellion against the realm, and even conspiracy to assassinate King Henry III himself. These accusations mattered less for their truth than for their symbolism. Treason was the gravest of crimes. It was not just an offense against a man, but an offense against God's appointed ruler. In a society where kings ruled by divine right, rebellion was heresy, a wound against the very order of the world. William's life as a pirate now looked, in the eyes of royal propagandists, like a chapter in a larger plot against the throne. Every raid on a merchant ship became an attack on England's stability. Every insult to the crown was painted as part of an ongoing conspiracy. Whether William truly sought the king's death hardly mattered. By accusing him of regicide, the crown could justify a punishment so horrific that no one would dare to follow in his footsteps. The courtroom itself was theater. Nobles, clerics, and officials gathered, not to hear evidence, but to witness the king's justice in action. William's defiance on Lundy had made him a legend. But in that chamber, he was reduced to a symbol of treason, a villain whose destruction would prove the power of Henry's rule. The sentence was read aloud in chilling detail. William de Marisco was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This punishment was new, its cruelty unprecedented in England. It was designed with precision, not only to kill, but to obliterate, to dismantle body and soul in a manner that burned itself into memory. Death would not be swift, it would be a journey of suffering, each stage more horrifying than the last. Dragged through the streets, half-strangled, disemboweled alive, dismembered, and scattered. His fate was to become both a spectacle and a warning. In July of 1242, preparations began. A special gallows was constructed for the occasion. Crowds gathered in anticipation, not just from London but from the surrounding countryside. For them, this was more than punishment. It was theater. It was history in the making. On a hot July morning in 1242, William de Marisco was led from his cell to face the most infamous death England had ever seen. His body, already weakened by imprisonment, was bound with ropes. Horses were yoked to a wooden hurdle on which he was lashed, his face pressed against the rough boards. The crowd gathered even before the procession began, their voices, their voices rising in anticipation. This was no ordinary execution. This was a spectacle designed to be remembered. The dragging through the streets of London was the first stage of his punishment. The horses strained forward, and William's body scraped along the cobblestones, every bump and stone tearing at his skin. The sounds of jeering, cursing, and laughter filled the narrow streets. Children ran alongside, pointing. Merchants leaned from windows. Nobles observed from horseback. To all, this was a lesson. The pirate lord of Lundy, once untouchable, was now powerless, his humiliation complete. The symbolism of this stage was not lost on anyone. Once William had sailed freely through the seas, commanding ships and fortune. Now he was dragged like refuse, bound and broken, utterly at the mercy of the power he had defied. Each street he passed became part of the performance, each witness a participant in royal justice. His suffering was not private. It was the property of the crown, shared with every eye that watched. By the time the procession reached the place of execution, William's body was bleeding, battered, and half-conscious. But the ordeal was far from over. The scaffold that awaited him was not the simple gallows used for thieves and murderers. It had been specially prepared to accommodate the horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Its construction alone signaled the extraordinary nature of this event. As William was lifted onto the platform, the crowd hushed. The executioner, a man skilled in the grim art of measured death, stepped forward. Around William's neck, the rope was placed with deliberate ceremony. This was the second act of the performance, the hanging. He was raised into the air, his body convulsing, his breath choking away. But unlike an ordinary hanging, the goal was not death. The executioner watched carefully, measuring the time, ensuring that William slipped into the shadow of death without crossing the threshold. Before he could lose consciousness entirely, the rope was cut, and he collapsed to the boards, alive, but broken, gasping and writhing in agony. The crowd pressed forward, eager, anxious, many horrified, yet unable to look away. What followed would become etched into English memory as one of the most grotesque spectacles of state power ever devised. William de Marisco, barely clinging to consciousness after the hanging, was restrained once again. Assistants held his arms and legs tight against the wooden platform, pinning him like a specimen prepared for dissection. The executioner stepped forward with knives glinting in the sunlight. His task was not to kill quickly, but to prolong, to carve suffering into every moment. With careful precision, he cut open William's abdomen. A cry, ragged and desperate, tore from William's throat as his body convulsed. The crowd gasped. Some covered their mouths in shock, others cheered, while a few crossed themselves in fear of divine wrath for witnessing such cruelty. From the gaping wound, the executioner began to draw out William's entrails. He moved with deliberate care, ensuring that his victim remained conscious throughout the process. This was not just torture, it was theater, a performance of power. William, who had once mocked the king's reach from the safety of Lundy Island, was now forced to watch his own destruction. The organs were cast into a brazier, the flames leaping high as the flesh sizzled. Smoke rose into the air, heavy with the stench of burning, drifting over the crowd. Witnesses gagged at the smell, yet they stared, compelled by the horror before them. Chroniclers later recorded that William's entrails were burned before his very eyes, as if the king himself wished him to see the final insult. Not only would he die, but his very body would be consumed as a sacrifice to royal vengeance. The symbolism of fire was powerful. It represented purification, the cleansing of treason from the land. The rising smoke was both practical, it ensured no relics of sympathy could be kept, and symbolic, a dark reminder of the king's wrath visible across the city. As William's strength ebbed, his voice reduced to gasps and broken cries, the crowd shifted uneasily. The sheer extremity of his suffering left some in awe, others in disgust, but all understood the message. This was not the fate of a mere pirate. This was the fate of traitors, a punishment meant to terrify and to endure in memory. And yet, even this was not the end. William was still alive, still breathing, still conscious enough to face the final act of his ordeal, the quartering. The platform, already stained with blood and ash, became the stage for the final chapter of William de Marisco's punishment. His body, ravaged by dragging, hanging, and disembowelment, still clung to life. That was the executioner's grim craft, not to end quickly, but to stretch the boundaries of survival until death became inevitable, slow and spectacular. Now came the quartering. Assistants, hardened men accustomed to brutality, brought out axes and heavy knives. The crowd, though shaken by what they had already seen, leaned closer, compelled by the horror of what was to come. William's limbs were stretched apart, bound tightly with ropes. With brutal swiftness, the first axe came down. His arm was severed, the spray of blood marking the executioner's apron. Then another strike, his leg. Each blow was both physical destruction and symbolic dismantling. The rebel was being broken apart, reduced not to a body, but to fragments, stripped of the unity that once made him dangerous. Piece by piece, William de Marisco was cut into four quarters. Chroniclers tell us he was alive for at least part of this process, his body writhing until the loss of blood and shock finally overwhelmed him. To the medieval mind, this was fitting. A traitor did not deserve the mercy of swift death. His very being had to be torn apart, his rebellion erased limb by limb. The ritual did not end with death. Each quarter of his body was carefully preserved, treated with salt, tar, or boiling to prevent immediate decay. These fragments were destined to travel beyond London, sent to cities and towns across England. There they would be nailed to gates, hoisted on spikes, displayed in public squares, grim warnings to all who might think of treason. William's head was granted the highest honor. It was severed cleanly, mounted on an iron spike, and placed above London Bridge. For years, travelers entering the city would pass beneath his lifeless eyes. Merchants, pilgrims, and nobles alike would look up and see the skull of the man who had once defied a king. His head became a permanent sentinel, proclaiming the price of rebellion to all who entered the capital. The scattering of his remains was not mere cruelty. It was political communication. In a kingdom where most people could not read, the sight of a traitor's body part, blackened and rotting above a city gate, was a message more powerful than any written decree. William was dead, but his destruction was alive, carried on the roads, rivers, and bridges of England, whispering the king's warning across the land. When William de Marisco's body was scattered across England, his story did not end. It transformed into legend, rumor, and warning. In London, his head loomed above the bridge, its lifeless gaze fixed on the Thames, a constant reminder to merchants and travelers. In distant towns, his dismembered quarters swung in the wind, grotesque beacons of the king's justice. The effect was chilling. No outlaw, no pirate, no knight who thought of defying Henry III could ignore the message. Rebellion would not only cost you your life, it would erase your very body, your very memory, leaving nothing but fragments and fear. The people of England remembered William, though not all in the way the crown intended. For some he was a villain, a pirate who deserved his fate, proof that divine justice had aligned with royal power. But for others, especially those who resented the king's taxes or sympathized with rebellion, William became something more complicated, a tragic figure, a man broken not only for his crimes but for the sake of political theater. His death was not just punishment, it was propaganda. The execution of William de Marisco marked a turning point. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was no longer a one-time spectacle. It became the standard punishment for high treason in England, used for centuries to come. Generations of rebels, plotters, and dissenters would meet the same fate, dragged, hanged, cut open, and quartered, each time with the same purpose, not only to kill, but to terrify. William's death was the prototype, the first draft of a ritual of state violence that would echo through medieval and early modern history. Even today, his story feels almost unreal. A pirate lord ruling an island fortress, hunted by a king, brought down by betrayal, and executed in a manner so cruel that it shocked even his own time. He was both man and myth, both criminal and symbol. The brutality of his death ensured that he would never be forgotten, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as the first to endure the most infamous execution England had ever devised. And perhaps that was Henry III's greatest victory. Not only did he destroy William de Marisco's body, but he made his death immortal, a dark legend carried forward through chronicles and stories for nearly 800 years. The king had proven that rebellion could not only be crushed, it could be made unforgettable.